Today, we're digging into something you've probably seen but maybe never fully understood: the Taweez. For some, it's a deeply sacred part of their faith. For others, it's a symbol of controversy. You've got this ancient practice that's now surrounded by all these modern myths and a ton of confusion. So let's unpack all that and figure out what's really going on.
So right at the heart of it all is this one big question. Is a Taweez a legit object of devotion, just a way to keep sacred words close, or is it a step over the line into forbidden superstition? And figuring out where that line is, well, that's the key to understanding this entire topic.
So first things first, what is a Taweez? You might also hear it called a hers. It's basically a small amulet. Now the key thing, according to the perspective we're exploring, is what's on the inside. For it to be considered permissible, it can only contain verses from the Quran, the names of God, or well-known established prayers. And the purpose is always the same, seeking some kind of protection or healing.
Now, to really understand the argument for the Taweez, we've got to get our heads around this one single principle that everything else really hangs on. And that is the idea that the Taweez is just a tool, not the actual source of power.
The source explains this with a really powerful analogy. Think about it like this. When you're sick, you take medicine, right? You see that medicine as the means to get better, but your ultimate belief, your real trust, is in God as the one who truly heals. The argument is that a Taweez works in exactly the same way, but for spiritual issues. It's seen as a kind of spiritual medicine. It's the means you use, while your absolute 100% belief is that only Allah is the one who grants protection and healing.
And this isn't an idea just pulled out of thin air. The theological backing for it comes directly from verses like this one. The argument is that the Quran itself, the words within it, are described as being a healing and a mercy. So the power isn't being given to the object, the paper or the locket. It's attributed to the divine words that it carries inside.
Okay, so even if you get that principle, there are still these three huge concerns that pop up all the time. They're the big ones, so let's just tackle them head on, one by one.
And here's the first one. It is, without a doubt, the biggest worry for many believers. It's the fear that if you rely on a physical object, you're committing shirk, the one unforgivable sin of associating partners with God. So how does the source even begin to address this?
Well, the key distinction, the bright red line, comes down to what's inside. The source basically gives us a clear litmus test. If the amulet has weird symbols or names you don't recognize or really anything other than the Quran or established prayers, it's considered forbidden, haram. But if it only has the pure words of God, then the argument is you're not worshiping the object, you're just using it as a vessel, a container for those sacred words.
All right, concern number 2, magic, or Sihr. You can kind of see how things could get blurry here, right? It's easy to see how these two things could get confused. So let's look at how the source tries to draw a very clear line between them.
So how do you tell the difference? Well, according to this source, it boils down to two things. Where does the power come from, and what are you trying to do with it? What they call divine science relies only on the words of God, with the intention of understanding divine patterns for good. Magic, on the other hand, is said to call on other beings, use impure things, and its whole purpose is to cause harm and chaos.
And that brings us to the third big myth, that the Taweez is a forbidden innovation, a bid'ah. The idea that this was just made up later on and wasn't something the earliest Muslims ever did, so it's not allowed. To push back on that innovation idea, the source points to this really specific historical account. It talks about a companion of the Prophet who would actually write down a prayer and then hang it on his little kids, the ones who were too young to memorize it themselves. This story is presented as the key historical precedent, not for the modern metal locket, but for the principle behind it, the act of writing down and carrying sacred words for protection.
Okay, so we've waded through some of the heavy theology. But what about the practical, day-to-day questions? The kind of stuff you'd actually wonder about if you were thinking about this for yourself.
So let's start with the modern kind of skeptical question, right? Isn't this all just a placebo? Does it only work because you think it's going to work, with no real power of its own?
Now, the source makes a really key distinction here. It says, hold on, it's not that simple. A placebo's effect, yeah, that comes purely from what's going on in the patient's mind. But the power of a Taweez, in this view, is a two-part thing. First, there's the barakah, the inherent blessing or spiritual energy of the Quranic words themselves. And then that power is unlocked and activated by the believer's yaqeen, their deep, unshakable faith. So the power's origin is seen as divine, not just psychological.
Okay, this is a question almost everyone has. It's super practical and comes from a place of respect. Is it okay to take something that has God's name on it into an unclean place, like a bathroom?
And the answer, according to the scholars who permit this, is actually built right into the design of the Taweez itself.
That casing, the leather pouch, the metal locket, the wax seal, that's the whole point. It's meant to be a protective barrier. From this perspective, since the sacred text is covered and sealed away, it's considered protected and permissible to wear it even in those places.
This next one leads to a really dangerous assumption people make. The idea that all these amulets are the same, and that any cheap one you find at a market stall is going to do the trick.
And this is where the source basically waves a giant red flag. They're saying authenticity is everything. A fake Taweez isn't just a waste of money, it can be spiritually harmful. They warn that a lot of these mass-produced ones contain nothing but meaningless scribbles, or even worse, satanic symbols designed to look real. So from this viewpoint, the effectiveness completely depends on two things: the purity of what's written inside and the piety of the person who actually wrote it.
So all of this leads us to our final section, which really challenges the biggest myth of all and tries to completely reframe how we look at this entire practice.
Now, this is a pretty bold argument. The source is saying, look, this isn't some backwoods folk superstition. They argue that it's actually rooted in a specialized, traditional science that focuses on the spiritual properties of the Quran. And they even point out that some of the most famous, heavyweight scholars in Islamic history, people like Imam al-Ghazali, actually studied and wrote about this very topic.
So when you look at it this way, the people who promote this practice don't see themselves as inventing anything new at all. They see it as a mission to revive what they believe is a profound but now mostly neglected part of Islamic heritage that's been lost or just misunderstood in our time.
So, after digging through all of this, where does that leave us? The debate obviously continues. Is the Taweez a tool of faith, a historical artifact, or something else entirely? The final question we're left with is a big one. Is this practice just a relic of a superstitious past, or could it be a lost science, just waiting to be rediscovered? Definitely something to think about.